Hello, everybody. So today we're going to be doing a little lecture. This is going to be your assignment for the week. Is copying these into your guided notes. Again, as explained to you why, so that way we can do some fun things. Maybe watch a movie, or go watch Selma or 42 when you guys come back from um, after your testing. So take out your guided notes. I will check this for completion. Um, I believe we should have left off somewhere around here. Again, the historic court case, Brown versus Board of Education, that's going to be a huge victory for civil rights leaders to end segregation in schools. Now, again, this was just schools, but think about things that we talked about before you guys had your state test, that this court case is going to set the tempo for future court cases and future challenges like segregation on busing, segregation in all parts of society. So this is the first kind of stepping stone for that. That this court case is going to set end of segregation schools, and then from there you're going to start seeing more things happening in society after this. But again, this won't come without challenges. As you guys see down here, southern states will be in no rush to desegregate. Some southern states are going to ignore it, as you guys saw in your ed puzzle that you guys did. So with that being said, one of the civil rights organizations still around today, very, very, very powerful. The NAACP, it stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And ultimately, guys, this group is going to challenge local laws, state laws, federal laws that discriminate against minority groups. So the NAACP is going to bring court cases to local, state, and Supreme Courts that are going to challenge segregation. It's going to challenge employment practices that are unfair towards African Americans. Voting rights that are going to be unfair. And again, they still do this to this very day. They have a lot of money, a lot of support, a lot of power. They have lawyers that work for them that work on challenging some of these unfair laws. Don't know if you hear me or not. Anyway. Um, There we go. All right, so you guys saw this in the Little Rock 9, in the Ed puzzle that I showed you guys. You can kind of see this down here. I'll move my face, you can see my face. But, after Brown versus Board, Arkansas is still desegregated 3 years later. Guys, Brown versus Board was in 1954. This is in 1957, where Little Rock had to desegregate. 9 African American students were allowed into Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, and the governor of Arkansas wouldn't allow it. So what he does, he sends in the National Guard to stop the children from entering the school. And this is like a big scene, a big raucous, a big deal. Like you have, for the first time, you have the school being desegregated. And a lot of families, especially white families, were not happy with it. Governor Faubus was not happy with it. So he stops them from entering. The court orders to remove the troops, mob riots, and President Eisenhower, because Governor Faubus in Arkansas is not following Supreme Court national law. President Eisenhower is forced to send in federal troops to escort these children into school and lead them to school, which is what you guys see right here. Again, a very historic moment. But again, as I mentioned earlier, southern states were not in a big hurry to do this, to desegregate on their own. So you guys see this picture right here. You guys see this as an example, a prime example of this. You see a white group, white students, white parents that are following these African American students into the school, yelling, spitting, throwing things at them. Think about the amount of bravery that it had to take. That these 9 African American students, they knew, the crowd that was going to ensue, and the fact that they knew this, and they knew that this moment was bigger than them, and what they were doing was going to help future generations. So a very powerful moment, and this is something, one of the things we'll get to in a minute with MLK, some of the things that he was preaching with, not being violent turn the other cheek, be the bigger person. Obviously, these people in the back, they don't, history as well as the media at the time made these people look very bad in terms of how they treated these students. So again, kind of going into Montgomery bus boycott, got a year or two after the Brown versus Board. Now it's taken the fight now to the busing in the southern states. Now, a lot of people that rode the buses back then were African Americans, and they had a lot of financial power. They paid money to ride these buses. So they felt like, obviously, it was in their best interest to fight against this unfair law, which is ultimately one of the things that MLK was preaching, to disobey unfair laws. So Rosa Parks obviously is going to break the law, and she's going to sit at the front part of the bus, refuse to give up her seat to a white man, and that leads to her arrest. So in response, MLK, something he was preaching is that, turn the other cheek, don't be violent. So what's the best way? What's the best way that we can challenge these laws? Well, it's by hitting the bus companies economically. So if we refuse to ride the bus, that means that these companies are going to hurt financially. It'll put them in a position where they have no choice but to confront the situation, which is kind of what they do. So this is going to last several years, or this is going to last a little over a year. That will force the bus companies to rechange their laws and allow southern states to rechange their stances on segregation on buses. So this was a huge victory for civil rights leaders, and after this moment, MLK and his organization called the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference Group, they are going to be really the leaders of the civil rights movement after really the boycott, be the unsung, unquestioned hero of this movement. Now you also see, again, as you start seeing some laws beginning to change, busing schools, you obviously still have a huge, you still have a lot of issues that are going on, especially with voting. So, and you still have segregation in other aspects and other businesses as well. So what you have happen is that you have a lot of students, a lot of younger people, they meet in Washington, D.C., and they do these freedom rides where they take buses and they go all over the South. They do this tour, and they are basically bringing attention, protesting against segregation in these southern states. If you look at their trail here, they going through Charlotte, going through Columbia, Atlanta, and then now you're heading into Mississippi and Alabama. Again, as we talked about, Mississippi and Alabama were the two states that had arguably, the biggest Jim Crow presence in these areas. And notice they're going in Birmingham, Jackson, Mississippi, Montgomery. So they're really going in the heart of Jim Crow. And obviously, guys, you got to understand, you guys saw a variety of different things in this class, that they didn't want their lives to be changed. They didn't want Northerners. They didn't want outside influencers. They didn't want the NAACP. They didn't want people coming in and telling them how to live. So you could imagine these freedom riders were not taken to very. They weren't taken very welcoming into these areas, and oftentimes they were met with violence. And in this case, you guys see a picture here of them going through on their bus. Through some of these southern states and southern cities. And then obviously you see this, an act of terrorism, an act of violence where somebody threw a bomb in their bus. So this group were met with heavy resistance, bombs, beatings, violence, you name it. But something that they felt very passionate about in terms of their, beliefs in challenging segregation and challenging and fighting for equality. In these areas. So as you guys as we talked about, MLK, his original name was Michael, and really starting from a very young age, he was kind of made and kind of pushed towards being a minister. His father was a minister, his grandfather was a minister. Being a part of the church at a young age was something that he was just around. And again, as we talked about, he believed in something called civil disobedience. I would highlight this term in your notes. So we talked about this briefly before we had our state test, but basically MLK believed that we should not follow unfair laws. So in the South, unfair laws were segregation. So he believed that people should break those laws because they're not fair. And a lot of this was inspired by Gandhi. Again, you should have learned about Gandhi and global issues, but he did very similar things. He used protests, he used marches, he used boycotts, he used nonviolent measures to protest British policies. So MLK studied this, and he saw the amount of progress that Gandhi made, and he implemented that. And MLK, he was arrested 30 times. His house was bombed. He was threatened. But MLK believed that integration was the best way to go, to break down racism, to break down the barriers. People need to be exposed to different cultures. They need to be exposed and live harmoniously amongst each other, not through segregation, because that causes stereotypes, that causes prejudices. But if you're integrated, you get to know people, and sometimes those barriers can be broken down. So you see examples like this, in terms of the resistance that was met. We kind of talked about this a little bit too with law enforcement with with their towards African Americans in terms of you see a nonviolent person here who's being the dogs are being sicked on them. Obviously, a pretty powerful photo, but ultimately, again, think of the message MLK is trying to convey. If this guy fights back, what photos may pass around? It's going to be him fighting back. But instead, if you choose to be nonviolent, like in this case, you build sympathy for your movement. You make the other people look bad, and it's ultimately what you're trying to do. You're trying to confront the situation and the law. So very typical to do for a lot of people. It takes a lot of strength to turn the other cheek. Obviously, you see a case like here. This is in Greensboro, North Carolina, the lunch counter, where you see white and African American students that are protesting segregation in the restaurants, and they're sitting at the front counter. They're not supposed to. Again, civil disobedience, breaking an unfair law, and you see what they're met with. They're met with resistance, people dumping things on them again, not retaliating, making them look bad, building sympathy towards your cause, bringing attention towards your cause in a positive way. Cases like this, again, same thing. So, MLK and a lot of civil rights leaders, they were met with, arrests and violence, threats, but they still went through with it. So finally, MLK was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. He was there to support sanitation workers, African American sanitation workers in Tennessee, and eventually he'll be murdered on while he's on his balcony. Now, quickly, Malcolm X. Malcolm X, again, his real name was Malcolm Little. His father was a reverend. He worked for African American rights. His father was killed by white racists. So you can think about that in terms of how that's going to impact his life and towards his views towards white people. Malcolm, because when his dad was killed, his mom kind of lost it, and him and his siblings were sent to different foster homes. So that led to him kind of having a very unstable childhood. He dropped out of school, turned to a life of crime. He eventually will be arrested, and while in prison, he learns that a couple of his siblings turned to this group called the Nation of Islam. It's basically black Muslims. And the leader of this group is Elijah Muhammad. And once he found out his sisters and brothers were a part of this organization, he started investigating, and he will end up joining it too. Malcolm Little will change his name to Malcolm X because Malcolm Little was his slave name. And he changed it to X because it's more like the unknown, the future. And that's where he would devote his teachings to the Nation of Islam, basically with this idea that they were preaching that the white man was the devil. They believed that things should be segregated. They were fighting for the Back to Africa movement or a country of their own. They believed that whites and blacks could not live harmoniously together like MLK was wanting. So he wants separation. And he also believed that if you see violence going around, then you should fight violence with violence. Don't take it. So it's very different from what MLK was preaching, that turn the other cheek. And he actually, Malcolm Little actually called out MLK too. He thought he was too soft on some of these issues. Malcolm X is going to lead the Nation of Islam. He starts having differences with Elijah Muhammad, the leader. They end up butting heads, and he ends up leaving. And he makes a trip to Mecca. When he goes to Mecca, he begins to change his views towards white people. He sees people working harmoniously together while he's there, and he begins to change his stance towards that. And ultimately, he will be assassinated too by the Nation of Islam.